Salvete omnes, pax vobiscum. My name is Father Mislav Pecek. I'm a Catholic priest from Croatia, currently living in Rome, and my studying at Angelicum, a pontifical university of St. Thomas Aquinas. And I love it here. It's beautiful to be in a university environment, to really soak in everything that you can from the professors with whom you actually live, because in this community where I live, there are over 20 different provinces, over 20 different countries from the world, and we are all priests within the community, like a convent, like a monastery. It's called convent, where we live, and it's like above the university actually, and professors and students living together. Now, of course, the student body is much larger, and there are a lot of lay people here, and religious sisters, etc., different diocesan priests. But the atmosphere is awesome. It's beautiful. And I am happy to say that I finished my exams a little bit earlier, and that I have the time that I really wanted in order to film something that is more in length. A video that takes a little bit more time to actually watch, to comment, and oh boy, to edit, definitely. And that one is, of course, the Sanguinius, the Rise and Fall of an Angel. Now, interestingly enough, I saw when this video was published immediately. And I was like, oh, I really want to make a reaction, because that was basically just after I learned of Sanguinius, and when I really started to like the character of Sanguinius, especially the speech at the Eternity Gates, which was a very fun thing to listen to and to make a video about. You can check in my channel the link below, if I think it's a link below, I don't know, where if you want to watch the actual reaction to the speech. But what I wanted to say, I knew I don't have the time at that moment to make a reaction. So I was really waiting for that opportune moment, and finally it is here. Now, I don't know if Luetin, who made the video, is like closet Catholic or simply watching the liturgical calendar, but he published this video on the eve of the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel. Could this be a coincidence? Well, if it is, then it is definitely a weird coincidence, but maybe it is not coincidence. Well, doesn't really matter at this point, but I think this is also a good moment to start with a prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel, a very appropriate prayer for today's video. And this video probably will be in 2 or 3 parts. I will see how strong is my stamina if I can make a reaction, because it's not just 2.5 hours of a video, it's like 2.5 hours plus my commentary, which is like 3.5 hours plus probably, and it would be too much to put in one video, maybe in 2 or 3 videos. I'll see how my fatigue will bother me. It will not be an exhaustion, because there's I'm happy with this, and I'm happy to be fatigued a little bit, enjoying myself. It's hard for me to constantly speak, but that's part of having a channel, interacting with you guys. I have to speak more, but that also means that energy definitely goes down after some time. And this is a long video. Okay, so let's make a short prayer together. If you want, you can pray together with me. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Sancte Michael Archangele, defende nos in proelio, contra nequitiam et insidias diaboli est oppressidium, imperet illi Deus supplices deprecamur, tuque princeps militiae celestis, Satanam aliosque spiritus malignus, qui ad perditionem animarum pervagantur in mundo, divina virtute in infirmum detrude. Amen. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. It's a prayer to Saint Michael the Archangel, not as if he were some kind of a deity, but he's a servant of God, and he's an angel. He has intellect and will. He, of his own free will, serves God, loves him, and he wants to help us. So we're just asking for that help, and we want to have connection with the angels as well. Friendly connection, if it's possible. It should be possible. If we are on friendly terms with God, of course, we're going to be on friendly terms with his angels and all the saints who are already with him. Now, this video, even though it was published only 4 months ago, already has 765,000 views, which was quite a lot. Of course, that is Luetin, a very famous lore master of Warhammer 40k, one of the famous lore masters. I already reacted to some of his videos, and I did enjoy it so far. So he has the most exhaustive video that is made regarding the Sanguinius, and that is the reason why I am doing this. Also, I recently made a reaction. You can also check it out, find a link down below, on the song, like a fan-made song in Latin about blood angels. That was a very cool experience. I really enjoyed that. I really did enjoy that, especially the Latin part, you know, but just the vocals and the theme, the atmosphere inside of the song, very cool. So I'm looking forward to this. I know just tiny bits and pieces about Sanguinius, about blood angels, and the tragedy of their lives. Well, everything is tragedy almost inside of Warhammer 40k. So let us immerse ourselves deeper, deeper inside of this beautiful lore journey. And let's go. Coffee.
This video is sponsored by Displate. Displate have returned with a beautiful example of one of their limited editions that was sent to me, featuring a stunning Primarch Sanguinius design, even finished with a fitting radiant gold border. It looks fantastic and is surely a piece that will continue to inspire as I create future content. This Sanguinius design is unfortunately sold out at the current time, but it may well return as a regular print in the future. Displate carry a massive catalogue of official artwork, including Warhammer, Elden Ring, Star Wars, The Witcher, Destiny and many others. They also host artists with their own designs. Any limited piece will be individually numbered, signed, a certificate of authenticity and premium packaging. And when I first had the opportunity to test out Displate, that mounting system was something of a question mark for me. However, now 10 months down the line, I've had no issues, no prints detaching in the night, and that's with me changing them over as and when I feel like it. So if you want fast mounting with no drilling or later holes to fill in, it's a great system.
I like this, to be honest. Yeah, it's a good thing. I guess this Displate focuses mostly on game content, especially with a little bit of more darker thematics. And I approve of authors, especially some people like Luetin, who really put a lot of effort in making their videos to have the videos sponsored, right? Especially if the theme of the sponsorship is so in accord with the work that they're doing.
Just apply the pad and magnet, snap the plate on, you're done. Plus, the magnetic mounts enable you to swap designs from your collection easily. Displate prints are available in standard finishes like matte or gloss, and you can add stylized borders as a design choice, though important to note, these aren't physical frames, they're part of the artwork itself and can trim a few millimeters off the actual artwork, which itself must be then scaled to accommodate that border. However, for certain images, the cropped style can work. I have a couple in this style with my own Displates. Their texture designs feature a raised contour style which catches the light and yes, the texture of the print. Originally, I wasn't sure if I would enjoy this at first, but actually the effect is more subtle and surprisingly satisfying in person to look at. Having owned Displate prints for the best part of a year now, I have to say they're definitely a product I would gladly recommend. In fact, so much so that I decided to add in another one of my favourite pieces of artwork, the Emperor's Golden Throne.
Ooh, that looks nice. It's a very large format, it would seem.
On Terra, which will be arriving with me very soon. I'll probably post images of it in a community post for the channel when it arrives, as I'm sure this is going to be an amazing piece for my home 40k studio. Plus, if you're ever stuck for a last minute gift, Displate orders usually arrive within 5 or so days. So check out Displate.
I guess that's on an American soil, though, right? If you're European, I presume it will be a little bit longer than that.
Displate today you will be supporting myself and the channel, and it's a product I gladly recommend, with many artworks in my own home office. You can also use my discount link in the description and pinned comment below, or use my code Luetin to get 32% off 1 to 2 displays and a massive 37% off 3+ displays. A big thanks to Displate for sponsoring this video, and once again, please check out the links directly below.
Okay. And now, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. A man who plans so long and so hard to be taken in, so at a moment of triumph. Nonsense. You are half the way to seeing the truth. Sanguinius, the great angel. Of course, having an inspiration from Saint Michael the Archangel, that's quite obvious. Different, of course, in many regards, but, you know, different sources of inspiration.
It should be no shock to any that this is a series long overdue. I've been all too aware that speaking to the Primarchs is an obvious necessity, but I also hope that it perhaps speaks to my sincerity as someone who enjoys the discussion of lore, that I didn't just rush to hammer out what even in a lackluster form would be very easily solid content. When it comes to the galaxy of M41, the Primarchs are foundational and structurally defining. For me, they're also intimidating in terms of their discussion, not least because, similarly to most of the big name characters and themes within the lore, their narrative is scattered across rulebooks, decades-old references, and weighty novels, so choosing to speak about any of them gives pause for thought. What do you leave out? What do you leave in? What do you summarize? Which of the 19, and yes, I'm including Alpharius and Omegon as individuals, even more so. Not to mention the eye-watering prospect of the need to reread heresy novels that you last looked at well over 10 years ago, which is what I had to do.
Okay.
Sanguinius has always been also a figure of obviously supreme tragedy, and while it may, to some, not land with necessarily the same gravitas that it did in the years of old, for myself, and I'm sure many of you, Mike McVeigh's diorama of the final battle between Horus and the Emperor resonated very deeply when it was first presented, and continued to do so over the years. And this was because it featured, of course, the shattered remnants of the great Angel Primarch, brutally slaughtered upon the vengeful spirit, before, of course, the ultimate battle for humanity and the galaxy would take place. In the decades since, each Primarch has been revealed through differing perspectives and stratified details. Some have novels which address their very specific origins, others, like Sanguinius, skirt around that or just cover it in brief. And that's likely because while it's necessary to be spoken to, it doesn't necessarily define them. Whereas for those like Lorgar or Angron, the events that took place prior
This is Angron here, I think.
to their rediscovery with the Emperor were so formative that it would define very much of their outlook, ideology, and character thereafter, their very decisions. So I think I will simply end this introduction by answering a common burning question among those who may not have read through the heresy or other adjacent material. That being, which novels or material speak most to the Primarch of the 9th Legion? Interestingly for Sanguinius, his appearances are relatively scant.
I like the scientific approach to things, you know, first listing the sources that he used.
Even in Fear to Tread, the 21st heresy novel in the series, and was for the longest time the single most significant in how it documents the Blood Angels and speaks to their Primarch, it's hardly focused entirely around Sanguinius and the exploration of his character. That is limited to moments. Although as the narrative goes, it does build a solid picture also of the Legion and Sanguinius through his orders, expectations, and actions in one of their most notable campaigns. Other than this, the other descriptions were perhaps in the Codex books or the so-called heresy black books, which are the vast tomes of lore largely penned by the legendary lore writer Alan Bligh. Of course, there are many other adjacent mentions throughout the heresy series. For example, in one of my favourite books, Know No Fear, we see one of the typical passing mentions Sanguinius receives. A single sentence delivers to us an understanding of how Guilliman feels, where it's described how Dawn, Russ, Manus or Sanguinius, Guilliman always claimed he could win any war outright against any foe, with basically those alongside to aid him. And whilst I'm speaking about Know No Fear, which I guess spoilers details the Wordbearer's infamous engagement at Calth, and I do have to note it also features a description that I position as one of my highest ranked from the entire heresy. That's where we see the spontaneous execution of an Ultramarine without him even being able to react, as he and a brother Wordbearer were just leisurely talking about the semantics of their purpose. The full weight of that execution and its brutality, its ideological impossibility, underscores in just a single moment the horror and the travesty of what is only now becoming fully apparent to the Loyalists. And honestly, that moment and the descriptions which run up to it are so significant, I really need to get that, frame it, and put it on my office wall, because it really, if you read the sentence, it really has so much weight. Anyway, my point being, that's just a passing reference, but sometimes passing small references, like Guilliman referring to Sanguinius, it speaks volumes to the character of others. And this feeds into the greater understanding that helps us to frame portrayals in longer, more detailed novels.
Good.
And I mention this only to help clarify why having a greater picture of the lore is always important when reading about pivotal figures, as I often refer to the fact that the lore of 40k never comes from a singular source that is just irrefutable. It's delivered second or third hand. It's from those with questionable bias or just entirely unreliable. The Great Angel, for example, that's a novel entirely devoted to Sanguinius, but it also comes to us from the singular perspective of a remembrancer, which in some ways is more revelatory and reliable than if it were an invisible narrator, or even that of the lived experience and first-person perspective of Sanguinius himself. But at the same time, and for as reliable and honest as many remembrancers and their records are, you're still seeing things through somebody else's eyes and interpretations. And even in that novel, the remembrancer himself questions his own perspective and his own accuracy. In terms of other descriptions, obviously really then you get into the Siege of Terror, Echoes of Eternity, The End and the Death. We'll come to those things later on. So as is ever true within the galaxy of M41, we're left to interpret, to read between the lines more than we might otherwise wish to construct some literal absolutist analysis. But this, of course, is entirely the point.
The angel upon Baal. Baal is the planet, of course.
The scattering of the Primarchs is undoubtedly a subject that I will mention many times throughout this slow-to-unfold series. For anyone who is unaware, before the Great Crusade even began, the Primarchs created by the Emperor would be scattered across the galaxy through a warp vortex. Now, the exact cause of this for the longest time remained something of speculation and debate. And even now, while we know many elements involved, the ultimate defined design of what occurred is, in my opinion, still clouded. How so? Well, far be it from me to go on a tangent so early, but there is this figure known as Urda. She was a perpetual and very powerful Psyker. She was active prior to the Crusade and Unification, but whose origin and history otherwise remains largely unknown. She was revealed during the Siege of Terror series, and also that she was the mother to the Primarchs.
Yeah, supposedly she's the main one responsible for the scattering of the Primarchs in order for the Emperor not to impose his will directly. Something like that. She obviously disagreed with some aspects of the Emperor's vision.
But as did many of the Perpetuals, she significantly disagreed with the Emperor's plans once it became clear how he intended to use those superhuman beings he was creating, which personally I find to be a little brow-furrowing, because really, you didn't guess what the extremely powerful, weaponized genetic monstrosities were going to be used for? It feels like you probably should have paid a little more attention to human history across the past, 20,000 years as a perpetual, because it gives the same vibes of scientists nonchalantly creating an ultra-deadly virus for a Bond supervillain to deploy, aka Moonraker, and just abruptly wondering, you know what, Jenkins, what do you think he needs this 99% deadly virus for? Ah well, I'm sure it won't be anything too appalling or involve the death of millions, so best stick to our work. Now sure, maybe I'm being too cynical, because the Emperor is very well known for being entirely benevolent, but let's imagine you were planning to live on Kur in Monarchia, then you probably should have figured this out before the project was 99% complete. For Erda, it seems that only when the writing was on the wall did she apparently use her own power to scatter them, which is still pretty vague, but in the chaotic timeline of the Crusade and the Heresy, makes sense of a sort. Another factor relating to this, unfortunately, is time. Now, I've spoken about causal loops, the theoretical concept whereby somebody from the future uses some means by which to return to a moment in the past and influence events before, thereby deliberately or unwittingly ensuring the future as they left it comes to pass. This is also known as a bootstrap paradox, because there's no way to define a starting point for that loop of events. The event in question involved the word-bearer Argol Tal, who, at the behest of a demon Ingathel, destroyed the Gellerfield, protecting the Primarchs, thereby enabling their scattering into the warp. There also remains speculation that some of the Primarchs could have been contaminated during this period of exposure to the warp, and that's certainly plausible if not even confirmed, but it is effectively entirely still unproven. But all of which adds to the ongoing musings about time in 40k being linear or not, or if it exists as being both linear and eternal in some bizarre duality with the warp versus reality, which whilst very confusing seems to be superficially the case.
Interesting. The way of perceiving the world, for a Christian at least, would be some more of like a spiral. It has both the circular direction, perspective, dimension to it, which is basically the circularity was how the ancient civilizations always perceived time. Different seasons changed, night and day. It's very kind of intuitive to perceive it like that. But the linearity of time, that was a new thing. That was definitely something new that came. And well, the Jews in their account of the creation of the world, basically what today we would say like creation ex nihilo, the time that has started at one point, and even more important, that time has its own culmination, the peak. Okay, so we go towards something, and because of that, the beginning point and the end point in time, and we are somewhere in between. Of course, we perceive time linearly, definitely. But both is correct. Now, I don't know, the image of a spiral for me is kind of the easiest one to use to perceive time. It's very interesting and hard to even speculate about time. I remember being a younger chap and not being in faith yet, but being kind of interested or fascinated by the first historical autobiography ever made. It's called The Confessions by St. Augustine. He was not a canonized saint when he wrote it. He was just like a bishop remembering his lives, of course, through the prism of his faith that he lived at that time, looking from basically the earliest childhood and the things which he did. He was a wild gun, that's for sure. And he made an autobiography. It's cool. It's a fascinating book. And the 10th chapter of the book, so to say, it would be like 10th book of the book. I think it's a 10th 10th or 11th. It's about time, and he's a brilliant philosopher and theologian, and he speculates, he writes about time, and I'm like, wow, you're losing me. It's really, really difficult, but I mean, it's fun as well, especially when you're younger and the first questions about the essence, the meaning of time and stuff like that arise. What the big question for me, an issue right now, is the time travel. It's a relatively new sci-fi concept. I don't know if people spoke about time travel even ever before, since like in the 20th century. That would be a fun thing to research. Time travel as a, just a speculative concept in the modern times, in the Renaissance times, medieval times, ancient times. I don't know. Anyhow, I think it just creates confusion and issues, especially when you have such a large story and so many dimensions to a story. I think it kind of worsens the story, unfortunately. If the whole story is based just on time travel, then okay. There are good stories based just on time travel. Back to the Future, hello, epic, great movie of my childhood. That's definitely true, yeah. To be honest, for Warhammer 40k, I think the time traveling concept kind of dilutes the gravity of some things, and it just makes the story kind of worse. Still good, but kind of worse. This is my opinion. I don't know what is your opinion regarding that? Do you enjoy the uncertainty of everything through the concept of time traveling and changes, or are you kind of a hater of that as well as I am?
And this ties interestingly into the last aspect for one novel that I didn't reference earlier, being Pharos. Now, Pharos in the greater lore is, of course, significant about the event that potentially triggered the attention of the Tyranids to the galaxy. But specifically relating to the Primarchs, it's also an exploration of the dynamic between two of the most key characters and how the raw truth of the Emperor, Crusade and Heresy was steadily being revealed. We're talking about Conrad Kurz, Primarch of the Night Lords, otherwise the 8th Legion. Now, Sanguinius was gifted, or in the view of Kurz, cursed, with the ability to have some level of foresight. From the perspective of Kurz, this only further entrenched his bleak nihilistic outlook. For Sanguinius, it was more existential. In Pharos, Kurz has been lying in the shadows of the world, which adds weight to his bleak realist perspective that even here, amid Guilliman's grand domain of prosperity, hope and charity, there are still these dark, forgotten corners where nobody cares to tread. Here are just the forgotten humans, the downtrodden. And Kurz believes that this signifies that all this grandeur and construction of humanity's great future is just a grubby lie. It's all for nothing and a charade in service to the Emperor's own magnificence and a stubborn ignorance to accept the reality of what humanity is at a base level in terms of its relationship with the warp.
Interesting and very indicative to how our personal philosophies really shape the way how we perceive everything around us, and of course in the end how we act inside of that perceived reality.
It's fundamentally saying we can't elevate ourselves, nothing can really ever change. And while confronting Sanguinius, the two have a fascinating discussion about their origins and the broader goals of the Emperor. Now, Kurz, of course, already believes the Emperor to be a liar and a manipulator, and really he could have come to this conclusion even without the whole heresy stuff going on. He pushes Sanguinius to admit that this cannot be denied. In fact, he says it is entirely self-evident, and that Sanguinius must surely agree to what Kurz and astonishingly Guilliman have already concluded, that the Primarch's scattering was no accident at all. And that the Emperor very much intended this to happen, no matter who or what else was involved to actually facilitate its occurrence. Because the most simple answer would have been that the Emperor saw what was going to happen and just thought, yeah, that's fine. Or of course, maybe he saw that it was necessary in order to fulfill other events. Regardless though, Kurz presents the most blunt and visible rationalization for this, That being the impossibility of the coincidental scenario whereby every Primarch just happened to land on a world that further then embellished or intensified their specific existing traits, which I think has always been a very obvious point to signify that the scattering was orchestrated. I'm sure that you've seen and thought about this and concluded the same for yourselves, because how would it have been, for example, if Guilliman had ended up on Barbarous, or Dawn Prospero, or Angron to Macragge, and so on? It just makes no sense. It's not to say that they wouldn't have survived or emerged somewhat representative of the characters we know them to be, but they certainly wouldn't have been so accelerated and amplified regarding their most powerful attributes that are gifted to them. They would have been probably more rounded and whole, and therefore likely the heresy or aspects of it would have been less intense or not happened at all. And also, given the pace to which the Emperor wished to carry out the crusade, you could consider this was entirely the purpose of the scattering. It gives a good reason to push out there to find them, not to mention other more subtle influences like a sense of gratitude and devotion in being rediscovered, instead of abandoned to isolation. It's also very motivational for the Space Marines to find their Primarch. Now, one could argue in the case of Angron you have the opposite thing happening, but again, very likely that's deliberate there to further increase his rage against all the different things.
His story of Angron is very interesting. I'm gonna make the video, like a full lore video of Angron and his background after this one. Also looking forward to it, yeah.
He's not happy when the Emperor finds him. He doesn't want to leave his world. He wants to resolve things. And the Emperor says, no, you've got to come away with me. Which, of course, makes him pretty pissed off and resentful. Again, probably by design. So Kurz, in his more realist view, had concluded quite reasonably that based upon this and everything else they know, that the Emperor is a twisted, cruel figure who has engineered every single aspect and event for them from the very beginning, which then just feeds into Kurz's view that the most important events in the galaxy are largely set and cannot be readily resisted or changed, that they are just pieces in a puzzle, which, as you know, kind of feeds into my view about eternalist time and sort of the situation within the galaxy regarding that. Sanguinius, of course, struggles with this because he doesn't want to believe it, but both Kurz and he share those future visions which show them slivers of detail which point toward these bleak future events which await, not the glorious one which is promised. And so it somewhat fulfills and actually confirms what Kurz is talking about, and Sanguinius doesn't want to hear it. But two of my favourite lines from their interaction are where Sanguinius throws at Kurz a statement in relation to his legion saying, "The faults of your sons are the faults of the father," talking about the Night Lords. To which Kurz retorts, "Oh, how very apt." Now he goes on to state that his children are not like those of Sanguinius, but I always like to imagine that he's actually, given the conversation they just shared about the Emperor, that he's mocking Sanguinius for stumbling over these words, and in that statement unwittingly confirming everything that Kurz has been trying to convince Sanguinius of, that the Emperor is flawed and his plans and actions abhorrent, that the faults of the sons are the faults of the father, that the events of the heresy can be attributed squarely to him and no other, which I would personally tend to agree with. Sanguinius, of course, does not agree, but personally it's hard to dismiss out of hand Kurz's argument, which of course is pretty crazy, but in the great picture it's likely far more nuanced than the bleakness to which Conrad tends to see things.
Yes. The sonship, the fathership, the very difficult influences and the strong influences that those dynamics have on us, of course. And I think it's rather clear that it's not the genetic part that is the primary issue here, but the nurture. So not the nature, but the nurture. You know, even though like the nurture of the Emperor in a way influenced the nature of the, even on a genetical part maybe, of these primarchs, but definitely the outlook that the emperor has on the world and that he pushed on his sons is the one that is so determining of their own behaviors and their own views. Not completely determining, but in one part. And I guess it's the same with us, isn't it? So one part of us we inherit from our biological fathers, but one great part, especially when we are more mature, we realize that greater part is the spiritual fathership, fatherhood, the influences that we have from our biggest role models, those who we look up to, right? Interesting enough, in the Bible, when the Pharisees classically were challenging Jesus, saying like, no, but we are the sons of Abraham, he's our father, and he retorts, no, the devil is your father. The faith that Abraham had, okay, so the spiritual component perspective, would have enabled them to recognize Jesus, who he actually is, as, well, the Messiah, as actually God. So the spirit behind that. But Abraham, the spiritual background, so to say, of his fatherhood was not in them, but of the devil, the father of lies. So the fatherhood does shape in what way we perceive the world and how we act. And the wounds of the father are deep and hard. We all have to kind of deal with that in our lives and try to find how to distinguish, make proper distinctions between the weaknesses of our biological fathers, which is a normal thing, and the truth as an objective reality in the fatherhood of our heavenly creator, who desires to be the father of us in order to adopt us, for us to become truly adopted children of God. It's quite a journey that we have to go through in these lives, isn't it? And it's kind of cool to see how it's our experience of reality is reflected in the fantasy sci-fi world of Warhammer 40k.
Between the two of them, though, I think their dynamic is best underscored with Sanguinius stating, "There is always a choice," to which Kurz replies, "There is never a choice." Anyway, that was a lot of chatting before we even get to Sanguinius, but it felt relevant to me, and I think it underscores the fact that the scattering was not necessarily as random or even unfortunate as it may have appeared to be. In fact, there is a very high probability that this was part of the Emperor's engineered plan to ensure some number of the Primarchs would enact a civil war, fulfilling either part of his plan or an unchangeable node of fate. And either way, now I've talked about all this, I won't have to again. Regardless of the why, though, the scattering happened, and thus Sanguinius arrived upon the moon Baal Secundus. It was a desolate world, not lush or verdant or bejeweled. It was an inhospitable, poisonous wasteland. Still, in the grand scheme of the worlds the Primarchs found themselves upon, it definitely could have been worse. Baal and its 2 moons were destroyed long ago in some undocumented apocalypse which saw both atomic and viral war unleashed. And as extreme as this may sound, planets colonized by humanity which saw such an end are in fact typical of the harrowing destruction seen during the Age of Strife. In this age, colonized worlds simply imploded due to resource limitations and damage caused by the prior war with the Men of Iron and their own isolation.
Yeah, it's kind of familiar to me from the Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader game. It's just stumbling upon random planets and finding kind of abandoned colonies or colonies who lost contact with the rest of humanity, presumably even from the Age of Strife. So I understand this part.
Often, all that was left were remnants of humankind that had come before, warmongering lords thirsting for power, or nomadic tribes, cyber-barbarians desperate for control over dwindling resources. So the world upon which the infant scattered from terror found itself upon was desolate, its air thin and irradiated, its surface twisted and malformed by centuries of fallout storms. Of the groups that survived in the form of scarred human relics, They were little more than nomadic tribes who endured a precarious life of little more than scavenging and sheltering in cave systems. Unable to escape the contamination, their bodies and those of previous generations had become significantly genetically damaged, which led to them having mutated and deformed physical states. They held no records of what had come before. They barely had anything which constituted a civilization. They were only able to chronicle something of the events which passed through oral storytelling. In time, this would become a characteristic to which the Blood Angels themselves were known for. So the fact that the winged Primarch would find itself upon a world where mutation was commonplace seems, one might argue, in this instance, extraordinarily fortunate. For upon numerous other planets, the discovery of a child with vestigial wings would likely have led it to being immediately killed there and then, if not purged with fire. And I think just a reminder to observe that the Primarchs were certainly powerful, but most of them still mortal. In their initial infant form, it would not have been impossible at all for them to have been murdered by the dregs of humanity. Not so upon Baal Secundus, although saying this apparently even then, there were still those who found the fact that such a pristine child could survive in the inhospitable wastes troubling enough they felt that they needed to call for its death. It wasn't mutated enough comically, but this did not occur. The Baalite tribes would recount the tale of how he came to be among them over many centuries, so much so that it would be ingrained into their collective cultural memory. All the Primarchs grew and advanced at a staggeringly inhuman rate, so that within only weeks the child upon Baal was readily walking, even escaping from his tribal wardens. It is said that at one time they even found him within the lair of a Baalite fire scorpion, and to their astonishment, the unarmed infant had destroyed the creature. This was despite being stung by its extremely poisonous venom several times, enough that it should have killed any ordinary man. So Sanguinius...
So like a Herculean figure, of course, from the, if I remember the myth correctly, Hera, she comes with a desire to kill the child, even while being an infant. She releases the snakes, and the child just slays the snakes. Yeah, kind of reminiscent, I think, of that event.
It grew to where his wings were of pure white and in impressive span, unlike those of the tribe he had been adopted into. He was a being of light and purity, and thus inspired awe and devotion from the tribe. Sanguinius was quite clearly a transcendent being. His form was one of such beauty that few could bear to look upon him, and unlike all others, he showed no weakness or vulnerability to the harsh surroundings that steadily poisoned even those accustomed to a life surrounded by it.
Okay, wow. Yeah, I had no idea about this kind of a background about the planet Baal. Very apt. And now I see that there is there was much thought given to the writing of the story of history of Sanguinius, because he's not just Michael the Archangel figure. I mean, the wings, of course, are reminding us of that angelic figure, but he is written at least as a Christ-like figure. He descends on a planet aptly named Baal, so like under the dominion of evil. Baal is a demon, right? So with the Semitic nations, some of them, the people of that area, worshipped Baal, gave sacrifices, human sacrifices to Baal. So naming the planet Baal definitely kind of indicates, at least on one level, the corruption, the rule of some kind of an evil on that planet. And then we see the complete mutation, which is, again, theologically it's just direct correlation. It's not definitely not a coincidence from my perspective in writing in this kind of a way. The corruption, the genetic corruption, is reminiscent of original sin. So our corruption in our bodies because of the fall, because of losing the original integrity, the order within ourselves by which we have peace and communion with God, with ourselves, and with everyone else, nature included, that being lost by the first sin, original sin, and inherited throughout generations. These are like the mutations. We are much less than the original form that we should be. And then the pure being descends and, so to say, becomes like us, becomes one of us, and grows together with us. Of course, in the Gnostic accounts, Jesus would be like the one as a child immediately doing wondrous things, like pushing more on the divine image, while in reality, Jesus wanted to hide his divinity, at least up to a point, when he started to publicly announce the kingdom of God and have his preaching ministry. But yeah, he grew up just like a man. He hid his divinity, that's for sure. Unlike Sanguinius here, he cannot hide his, the fact that he's kind of special. But, just two things, just Baal and the type of a planet upon which he descends. Very, very interesting. Okay, a lot of different imagery used, both from like Christian imagery and some mythological Herculean, right, antique mythology imagery.
As was typical of the Primarchs, there would come a defining moment where those who have followed the miracle child became all too aware of what these individuals were truly meant for, that being war. Baalite myths describe how at one time the tribe of Sanguinius was surrounded by cannibalistic mutants who had gathered to numbers in the many hundreds. All had accepted their inevitable fate, for death upon the world was a constant. Sanguinius had other ideas. He rose to become their supreme protector, and in that moment of pure blazing light, as would be seen much later by the remembrances of the Crusade, Sanguinius's form shifted from the formal benevolent leader to that of the unleashed dark angel of death. It is described how he became a terrible red-black being, his eyes burning with a corona of light around his head. He unleashed a violent storm of irresistible destruction upon them, and when finished, he stood before them all, dripping in blood. Sanguinius would subsequently unite those tribes of mutants who had something approaching a constructive outlook for their own survival, and together waged a war against the more abhorrent groups of mutant human things which infested Baal Secundus. Despite being vastly outnumbered, with Sanguinius leading them, they won the conflict readily. Entirely understandably, the tribes of human mutants upon Baal came to worship Sanguinius, who very reasonably, in their eyes, was their ultimate salvation and a godlike being. So that by the time the Emperor found him, the people of Baal were troubled by what they witnessed, for in their eyes, what they saw was a god meeting a god. When the Emperor arrived upon Baal Secundus, Sanguinius was torn between the feeling of something he had never seen before, a spacecraft, yet also the surety of knowing that here was his father come to meet him. He knew even prior to their actual meeting that he had a father in this moment, and that was significantly notable as to the power of his foresight. Their meeting gives us an intriguing glimpse also into the Emperor. As is often the case when he meets with figures who rival his own psychic strength, there tends to be a little lapse on behalf of the Emperor. He is unsure about what they can see, and maybe he is unsure how much protection to put up in terms of shielding his own identity. So initially Sanguinius notes that the Emperor is human, but not quite a man, that he sees within his eyes the light of many souls, men and women. The Emperor also immediately exerts his power. He appears to speak the language of the world, but Sanguinius notices how the Emperor's perfection itself is a flaw. His impossible perfection was inhuman and considerably unsettling, so that right from the beginning, Sanguinius could see the glory and the horror, the success and celebration cast against the death and the raising of worlds.
So perfection is not actually a perfection in the truest sense of the word, not something that is completely as it should be, not something that is finished. It's more like an illusion of perfection. Very powerful in many respects, but something is lacking. And that lack is that which causes an unsettling feeling, even though you cannot describe what that actual lack is.
His foresight was already showing him the future to come. So when Sanguinius asks the Emperor what he is, we do get this glimpse into one of the most troubling questions speculated upon. For there is no answer, but it at least allows us to see that it is a possibility when the Emperor states, quote, "You are a Primarch, and you are my 9th General. You are a component of the great work. You are stolen by my enemy. Most unsettling of all, you may have been changed by them." The final admission is significantly troubling, but as we spoke to earlier, it's again a question of if the Emperor intended this all along, albeit with an element of randomness. There's another revelation, in my opinion, also, when Sanguinius tells the Emperor that he sees him as the death of faith, and the Emperor replies, yes, and also no, which I think could be suggestive that the Emperor does have some sense of his future, or at least one potential configuration which sees the reality whereby he becomes the God Emperor.
Yeah.
More likely, though, he's speaking directly to the fact that Sanguinius is worshipped by those upon the world here, and the Emperor wishes to simply note that faith is a dangerous thing among humanity, and so he has not come to simply destroy this, but to raise Sanguinius to his true design. Unlike other Primarchs, Sanguinius could see more clearly what the Emperor had in place for their future, and also the hypocritical compromises which undermined his ideology. For while worlds of faith who could not be turned to the imperial truth would be raised, others, such as the Mechanicum, were tolerated and compromised with, because their greater support outweighed the principles of the imperial truth. It was something which Sanguinius would never forget, and so when the Emperor told him of all the glory he sought to elevate him to and gift him through the Legion to command, Sanguinius considered what happened if he refused the Emperor's offer. The Emperor, of course, knew that he would not, and when all Sanguinius wished for was those of his tribe to be left unharmed by the Leviathan forces of the Emperor just approved, and Sanguinius joined to lead his legion. The Revenant 9th would become the Blood Angels. The 9th Legion, which had been steadily broken by attrition and brutality during the early period of the Crusade, they were often cast into the most brutal compliance campaigns, deployed without reinforcement to worlds where resistance was fierce and terrain unforgiving. Their mortality rate was among the highest of all the legions, and their replacements were very scarce. So they had this reputation of sanguine savagery. They fought with the relentless assault doctrine, choosing close quarters melee engagements wherever possible, and records describe entire campaigns that were effectively reduced to butchery, civilian populations extinguished alongside enemy combatants. They were known to pursue their foe until nothing remained alive to resist, which interestingly was how Sanguinius himself tended to view things. He held a very all or nothing perspective. I think very often there is this projection from what happened later upon earlier legions, in the sense that loyalist legions never had the same conduct seen among those like the Night Lords or the World Eaters. But that really couldn't be further from the truth, especially in the case of, say, the Space Wolves. In terms of the Revenant 9th, their conduct even earned them censure from Imperial commanders because of just how brutal and slaughtering they were. Yet their value was still unmistakable. They were this irresistible blade, unsheathed when horror itself was required as an instrument of compliance. But things changed significantly upon the Primarch's return. The transformation from their bloodthirsty, near-barbaric practices to becoming swiftly under his hand paragons of martial prowess. Still, darker practices that had begun to become a concerningly regular part of the Legion were also now more strictly concealed. They learned to cloak their ferocity, replacing it with artistry and gilded nobility. Sanguinius's winged presence also created a mythology which tied very cleanly to his own presence upon the battlefield. for they were the angels of death.
Interesting. Now I wonder whether the hiding of that ferocity, I mean, there has to be more depth than simply, let's cloak our true nature. What made them so attracted to something of a higher culture? What made them even want to hide that ferocity? Those are the questions that first popped to my mind.
And the ferocity remained, but it became more directed and supervised. They were the blood angels.
Good.
Sanguinius was the great protector, the healer, the transformer and unifier. Yet for as much as he is characterized as the one who cared, he was as much a destroyer as any other. For all the Emperor's creations were designed for one thing above all else: war.
Loyalty and idealism.
With the return of Sanguinius, the 9th Legion was remade, and under his leadership, brutality became discipline. Where once there had been unrelenting grinding slaughter, now efficiency became the order of planetary conquest. Sanguinius was able to harness their ability to combine shock violence with inspiring spectacle. This was something known throughout the Crusade, that crushing colonized worlds was not always necessary. This only applied to those who were the most resistant to compliance. For many, the combination of irresistible force and wonder was more than enough to convince them. The sight of off-world humans with immense power, and a figure such as Sanguinius approaching with wings of white clad in golden powered armoured suits, warriors wearing battle standards which espouse their angelic form, all directed toward an even greater superbeing, the Emperor. Worlds fell in line far more swiftly than they ever had as the Revenant Ninth. Sanguinius became in fairly short order one of the Emperor's most beloved sons. For where those such as Perturabo or Angron had struggled for recognition by pretty much getting in their own way as much as their natural traits were problematic, Sanguinius seemed to be the exemplar of the Primarch project. He certainly was one under the consideration for Warmaster by the Emperor alongside Horus and Guilliman. And this is something mentioned several times throughout the chronicles of the Crusade and the Heresy. His relationship with Horus stands out particularly in Say Fear to Tread, where we're able to see the closeness between them. You have Horus praising him openly as seeking his counsel, and then later committing to conceal secrets for Sanguinius that are revealed about the problematic nature of the Legion. They both admit they will keep this sealed, even from the Emperor. The connection between Sanguinius and Horus is far beyond the superficial tragedy of the heresy, and through the descriptions we see in Fear to Tread and also Know No Fear, you get the sense of just how significant it is, that the one who fought hardest to redeem Horus was also the one who would be most betrayed, because no other than Sanguinius faced Horus so plainly in the most dire of hours, other than obviously the Emperor, and I think that really exemplifies all that he was.
That's kind of also the Jesus-Judas relationship in a way. I mean, from looking from the gospel perspective, it's not like Jesus didn't know the secret of the Judas heart, but he did not throw him away. He was aware, of course, as well, that he came here to suffer and to die for the redemption of sins, for the salvation of human souls. But that doesn't mean that he didn't truly, in his heart, have an intention, a burning desire to save Judas. Judas still, in the end, betrayed him. Yeah. Horus and Sanguinius. Let's see what their relationship actually was.
Foresight, his uncompromising nature. Sanguinius embodied that close loyalty between the Primarchs and often chose to act as a mediator among his brothers. But I think it's important to consider one fact in relation to this, for while it is clear from even the first meeting with the Emperor that Sanguinius has an empathetic nature, we should also consider that this, at least to some degree, may have been shaped by his foresight ability. For example, If you imagine Sanguinius seeing a destructive fracture between two others, then his attempts to heal divisions can be read as more than just simply a wish for calm or an idealistic peace. And it becomes more about a conscious defiance of potentially destructive paths. Anyway, that's just my speculation, but it seems more than plausible to me. I think in that sense you also have to consider the impact that any Primarch and Legion would have upon each other, and that can be said for all the Primarchs and Legions. The Ninth, even after Sanguinius returned, remained touched by that infamous genetic or potentially psychic flaw. They carried the instability that manifested as the Red Thirst, this craving for blood and a savage madness in battle. Sanguinius concealed it because he hoped to address it in the aftermath of the Great Crusade. He did not want for this to become a distraction or undermine their efforts, and he felt that he could manage it. But that aspect was hidden as much as possible or otherwise cloaked in that outward discipline, the ceremony, the grandeur of the Blood Angels. And this is where, in The Great Angel, we see the disparity between the lived experience of remembrancers who were placed with the Blood Angels and the imperial propaganda that described them as living angels, this really aspirational idea of what an Astartes could be. In reality, the propaganda bore no resemblance to the raw brutality that they exhibited in battle, so much so that it was really shocking for the remembrancer at hand. They also concealed this thirst of the floor, which only grew worse as the heresy descended. But of course, even the worst situation that occurred for them at Signus, which we will get to, Sanguinius' reputation remained untarnished because his brothers respected him, the Emperor trusted him, and the mortal soldiers of the Imperial Army, or any world he was present upon, needed to revere him for what he appeared to be. This saint-like figure, despite of course religion not being a thing in the Imperium at that time, this demigod creation. Except of course, unlike Lorgar, whose pursuit of doctrinal faith was very rejected, Sanguinius walked this line whereby he had this presence of being a spiritual being, but kept strict adherence still to the imperial truth.
Lorgar, he is the main one of the word bearers, right?
While surrounding himself with this aura of supreme loyalty to the imperial dream, the crusade, and the emperor. And in some ways, Sanguinius is very like the emperor in that sense. When you see his form, you think, wow, that's a godlike being, and of course humans are going to feel drawn to that in a spiritual way, but then at the same time they're looking you straight in the eye saying, I am just a regular human. But unlike the Emperor, and more like Conrad Kurz, Sanguinius' outlook of loyalty and the uplifting of worlds became tainted by his understanding of the true reality that lay beneath. His foresight contaminated his perspective, and so what was seen as uncompromising discipline and urgency was very likely an urgency in mind with the knowledge of what was still to come. In some respects, Sanguinius' life was very idealistic, but also defined by sacrifice. For where Horus had been raised to exude and manage power, Guilliman had learned to forge an empire, but Sanguinius lived a life that was simply determined. They felt like they had achieved true things. Sanguinius, though, lived this life that felt predetermined. He played his part, he moved the pieces, he committed to it, but ultimately he knew that he was walking toward an inevitable, inescapable end.
Yeah, this is like a classical tragic hero type of a figure. Well-written tragic hero type of a figure.
Just like Conrad Kurz.
The Burden of Foresight.
If you are new to learning about the galaxy of M41 or the period of the heresy and the crusade, you might not be aware of just how important the role of foresight or psychic abilities plays. Time shenanigans remains thankfully a smaller part of the order of things because, as you all know,
thankfully,
I dislike this and I'm forced to tolerate it at arm's length because I pray it never becomes more than that. Psychic foresight, though, the ability to just see into the future, the short or the long term, is heavily embedded into the nature of the Warhammer narrative.
Now that is different. I'm also fine with that. Okay, again, within the confines of our reality, especially observed under the Catholic worldview, we can see some things which are predetermined in our future, okay, within the whole history. Not everything, but some things. So foresight then, as such, definitely makes sense. Also, if you have an omnipotent, omniscient being who knows everything that will happen, a gift of prophecy or having foresight regarding some future events definitely does make sense. That is completely not related with the idea of traveling back to past for the purpose of changing the future. That's really, really different. So, yeah.
And it is more plausible because it's not singularly among humanity. The Eldari are one who place significant weight into their ability to foretell and look at what potentially lies ahead. This power forms the foundation of everything the Emperor was looking to achieve with the Crusade and his projects, even while it remains the subject of speculation. In short, I feel we can safely say at this point in time that the ability to see into the future is not solid nor defining necessarily of everything that is to come.
Yeah.
But it can be defining about specific moments.
Perfect.
It's not the reliability or strength any one individual has in regard to foretelling either. It's more about how future events themselves appear to be formulated to be more or less malleable, but with no real parameters about how or why that is necessarily the case. It's all very confusing. Some events appear to be unchangeable and locked in, others are entirely the opposite. Some races, like the Eldar, have a general psychic ability among their people, and so even Eldar who are just simple warriors appear able to display the ability of foresight and see seconds or just moments ahead into the future. It gives them an unnaturally fast reflex in combat because they're always seeing slightly into the future, whether or not they're even able to perceive that.
Yeah, I know that different fantasy worlds utilize that kind of a mechanic, I guess. It could be like a combat mechanic, a little bit of foresight in the future. The first association right now was very popular anime and Japanese comic book manga One Piece, where one of the abilities were very high advanced abilities of the best fighters, I guess, is something of a foresight, able to predict what's going to happen next and then to have much faster reaction or to completely change your course of action because of that. It's basically the same concept, just applied to a different setting.
Among the more powerful psykers within the Eldar, like Farseers, or within humanity like the Emperor, they attempt entirely different levels of foresight. They're looking centuries or even thousands of years into the future, and it cannot be underscored just how complex and difficult such efforts are relative to trying to interpret what actions they need to execute in the present to influence the future at such a distance. And I think when you start to really understand that, it helps you understand just how complicated and challenging what the Emperor was trying to achieve really was. Among the Emperor's sons, Sanguinius stood apart for the clarity of his gift. He did not display necessarily the psychic might and the sorcery of someone like Magnus, nor was he burdened by the oppressive visions that plagued Kurz.
Right.
And I think we do need to note were as much influenced by his reality and personality as much as anything else. But what Sanguinius received were more typical of those capable of foresight, fragments of what might come to pass, impressions without context, half-glimpsed uncertainties, and occasionally, as was the case with his own future, actions that appear set in stone. For those around him, Sanguinius' behaviour appeared to further reinforce his miraculous nature, proof that he walked with the touch of destiny. He's exhibiting that same sort of ability that the Eldar have, moving almost ahead of time. And although very different to Comrade Kurz from the Night Lords, Sanguinius shared their understanding of this existential constraints that are placed upon them by their own ability. Again, in The Great Angel, our remembrancer Cortenia presses him to explain about this. Sanguinius, ever pragmatic, admits that in order to see the future, it's a paradox, in the sense that far from making you invulnerable, as one might imagine, it can in fact be the opposite. Yes, you may have some small ability in the short term, but he best describes its nature as sometimes of concrete things, the way an enemy moves, the curve of an axe, but sometimes of more nebulous things, the shape of the crusade, the fate of a soul. He also says that a vision can lead you into error, or even, if it is true, you can take the wrong path by seeking to achieve it. It can come to obsess you. You see a fate you wish to avoid, and in preventing it, you cause greater harm. Or you become possessed by longing for something good and put aside your duty to achieve it, and in doing so, lose yourself.
Excellent. This is I love Luetin's explanations, by the way, really. Again, it's like it's a very good way what he just did to make a distinction between knowledge, special knowledge given to you by God through mediation of angels, maybe, doesn't matter, and through demons. The occult knowledge of some kind of a future or aspect of the past, whatever. But the source of the knowledge is very important because even though it might be factual, correct in most of the ways, if it comes from the source which is not God, it will, in the end, lead you to one of these things which Luetin just enumerated. So either to drive you to madness, to obsess about it, to completely make you do the wrong turn, okay? Think that this knowledge means something that it doesn't actually mean for you personally, and in the end, of course, turn you away from God even more. The gift of prophecy is not given to everyone, and it's not a gift one should ask for. It's not meant to be given for everyone. And when it is given by God, you are also then granted with enough other abilities, graces, virtues in order to carry something like that. Because the lives of the prophets were not easy and are not easy today either.
Foresight has its uses, but I do not see it as a blessing. Sanguinius explains something to achieve it, and in doing so, lose yourself. Foresight has its uses, but I do not see it as a blessing.
Right.
Sanguinius
I think the prophets of the past always, the holy ones at least, would view it as something like that. It's like both a curse and a blessing. God uses them for some specific purpose. To do good, of course, but on a psychological, on a subjective level, for those men who were given those things, it's also a curse. I mean, it really makes their lives harder. It is for the purpose in the end for them, at least for sanctification, to learn to be even more deeply obedient to God, to trust in Him, not in their own powers. But of course, that comes with a lot of suffering. Yeah.
Explains something which I think helps us to understand the Emperor's position also, that of the fragments given, it is never the whole, and because of this, they are in many respects all but useless, because you're only seeing a few pieces of the entire puzzle and trying to simply guess what you need to put in between to complete everything. A man may dream of death and seek to avoid it, only to create the conditions by which it occurs. One might misread a sequence of events. They could alter a path to avert disaster, but step into another, far worse situation they're unable to foresee until they already altered the known events. Sanguinius sees things obviously through a far narrower lens than, say, the Emperor, but it does illustrate to us through his descriptions, as I say, the complex nature of the efforts of the Emperor and Malcador. I think in that sense, it begins to become understandable just why the planning of the Crusade, his goals for humanity, this sense of the Emperor with all-seeing knowledge, yet simultaneously as if he had no idea what was going on in some moments, and at one point literally says this to the custodies when they ask, "What do we do next?" And the Emperor says, "I don't know." As Kerr observed, in some ways this is more of a curse. All your knowledge becomes suspect and unreliable, and at a certain point, what do you trust anymore? Each selected choice is just ringing with doubt. Is this the correct path, or is it a decision that will drive us all into ruin? It's bad enough for a Primarch attempting to secure a world or a system, but scale this up to the plans being laid out by the Emperor, and it becomes quite terrifying.
Yeah. So in our lives, like on a moral level, how we make decisions is determined by our virtue, a virtue called prudence. Okay, it's like the practical intellect, an ability to analyze different kind of situations in any given point of time and choose the best one which should be utilized. Okay, and then other virtues step in as well in order to actually go through that. Now, sometimes it's really impossible for us to make the proper calculation. We don't have enough information in the beginning in order to make the proper decision, so we cannot even calculate sometimes, or it's simply above our level. Okay, if we have like if you're smart person, IQ like 120, 30, like above average smart person, and there is some crazy calculation needed. You have to have an intellect 180 in order to just calculate that on spot. For you, it's impossible. Even though you're very capable, maybe very knowledgeable, maybe very experienced, for that specific thing, you are not able to do at that moment of time. And when we're speaking about making decisions regarding the salvation of our souls or the souls of others, so under the God's providence, if we live inside of communion with God, if we have the gift of grace as a concrete thing, not just some cloudy thing about which you speak in a theological sense, right? Then a very powerful and strong gift can be given to you, which is called the gift of the Holy Spirit. There are 7 of them actually. And one of those gifts, the gift of counsel, is designed to specifically perfect the virtue of prudence. So basically, God tells us what to do. Our prudence is elevated to a level which is simply infinitely higher, for that moment at least, than what it can do by itself. Okay, I want to do something that is good, but that's too much. God knows everything, so he can advise me on what is the best thing to do for me at that specific point of time. That's a gift of counsel, gift of the Holy Spirit. For those people who live outside of mortal sin, for those people who are obedient to the inspirations of the Holy Spirit, such gifts are not something that is unusual. Those gifts have to become a reality of our lives. It's a mystical factor, of course, but every Christian is called to live that mystical reality in their own daily lives. Okay, let's continue.
The Emperor saw futures where mankind triumphed, but also where they were destroyed. I do believe for the longest time he was able to see that his actions were securing the future for humanity. He's going down this path and he can see where things are going. But inevitably, through the need for secrecy, the reliance upon independent, often unreliable creations, the suppression of truth, it causes all of his foreseen plans to steadily unravel. There are just too many variables. And there's always this sense that it's steadily becoming narrowed down until the end. And I don't think he really knew the correct path, and that's what nearly caused him into becoming the Dark King, this new Chaos God. It was only averted in the final hours of the heresy when the Emperor could be convinced that there was an alternate path. And perhaps he couldn't see that until that point in time. So through Sanguinius' descriptions, we can understand why it is so all-consuming of an issue for those who see beyond the present, and why perhaps the Eldar appear the few who are able to walk this line between interpreting such matters and actually carrying out actions guided by them. The Eldar are extraordinarily careful about how they use Farsight, because they really do understand the consequences involved, and that even small adjustments could have gigantic eternal consequences. I think one of the most obvious examples we've referenced before comes in False Gods, very early in the Heresy series, where Horus is of course shown visions of the Emperor enthroned as a god. He is missing from this future also, the Primarchs abandoned, the Imperium crumbling. Horus is told that this is the inevitable path, this is where you get that paradox of foresight as a weapon. Horus has no understanding of what he is presented with, and although he may not have taken it entirely seriously, it embeds this idea of this being something to avoid, the idea that there is a potential future in which that could happen and not the path which he currently sees. And thereby this ultimately ensures, of course, that it does end up coming to pass. So just as Sanguinius described, the very effort to resist a vision can become the mechanism by which that manifests.
Yeah.
Sanguinius did not only see himself dying at the hands of Horus though, he also saw strands of the wider fate that awaited all, the fall of his brothers, the burning of terror, the darkness of the precipice they stood upon. But unlike...
Which was then, I guess, even harder for him to stand there at the gates of eternity, which makes his speech then, again, even stronger, even more brave, yeah?
Like Horus, he was able to understand not to take these visions as being necessarily fixed. Sanguinius' life was defined by struggle and transformation. He had a sense of being able to shape things. He rallied his legion, despite the corruption which ate away at their souls. He marched to terror, knowing full well he would not return. He understood the necessity of sacrifice, something that I'm going to repeat a lot in this video, and that was always in service of this sense of achieving something better. Although he shared much with Conrad Kurz in terms of foresight, that was where they significantly differed, because for Conrad, whose visions of endless tyranny drove him fully into nihilism, and perhaps also should include Magnus, who believed he could control destiny through mastery of the warp and its power through sorcery, Sanguinius saw and accepted the inevitability of his fate, and so when he walked through the palace during the siege, stood in defiance of the worst horrors of the warp of the Eternity Gate, he held the knowledge that this was not to be his final trial. He understood that something far greater and darker awaited. So, in that sense, every battle he fought was staged against the background of a death he had already accepted, which meant he could give a lot more in battles which led up to that, which interestingly is akin to some warrior philosophies such as that of the samurai, who are taught to accept the inevitability of death to practice this mental preparedness to thereby detach themselves from their worldly fears and their expectations, and in doing so become more effective through clarity of mind, enabling them to act very decisively. This
makes sense, of course. I mean, I really loved the background, the mentality, the philosophy behind the formation of Japanese warriors, Bushido. Samurai are those who serve, but the way how they fight, of course, is accepting, not being burdened by the consequences of the fight. You have to be free of those things in order to be void in a sense, like a specific, fighting virtue, we might call it, which enables you to act in the most spontaneous way, in the most perfect way, in each given circumstances.
Certainly some comparison to be made there between this and Sanguinius. To live with foresight is to inhabit a reality divided between the present and its potential. And as I spoke to earlier, there seems very little left to chance when it comes to the Primarchs, and so I wonder to what degree this was placed upon Sanguinius by design. Did the Emperor himself foresee the potential need for sacrifice, and that Sanguinius would be the only one capable of accepting that role without faltering? I think we could well imagine other Primarchs who would have definitely raged against such a destiny, unable to accept the inevitability of their own death. Sanguinius did not. He was taught to accept this from his very inception. He lived with it and stepped toward it unflinchingly. And this may explain why, in the end, the Emperor, despite his show of telling Sanguinius to remain behind, did allow him to face Horus aboard the Vengeful Spirit, because ultimately they both knew and accepted what had to occur.
The Angel at War.
The Great Crusade demanded unending compliance. For the Astartes and Primarchs under the orders of the Emperor, that meant by any means necessary. In the case of the Blood Angels, while Imperial records may laud their strategic and diplomatic elegance, remembrancers who travelled with them captured a more raw truth. This meant entire systems bent into compliance through precise yet terrifying displays of violence, and the wholesale extermination of any Xenos found. So, pretty standard crusade fare, you might conclude.
Yeah.
For all the splendour of the Primarch, such awe gave way to disturbing warfare. The Blood Angels fight with extremes of savagery that are difficult for mortal allies to bear witness to, and not just in the literal acts themselves. All Space Marines and Primarchs operate obviously outside of the standard limitations for a human, but the transformed warriors of the Emperor are not just enhanced in the sense of being more powerful. Their actions in the extremes seen among those such as the Blood Angels in combat become something truly disturbing. It's their speed, the intensity, the lack of hesitation in butchery. It unsettles the human brain. It triggers something which just says, this is wrong.
Yeah.
And while it may be typical to be seen in illustrations of the Astartes, that behaviour, it's not just superhuman, it is inhuman.
Yeah.
Which was, of course, very much by the design of the Emperor, and you see this very early, even in the unification, to create a force that would be his hammer to reshape the galaxy to which none could stand against. That same remembrancer, who was assigned to the Blood Angels, and you can read about this in The Great Angel, observed how Sanguinius himself was undoubtedly majestic in battle, awe-inspiring and glorious, yet somehow very wrong.
Now just a thought occurred to me, as if the Emperor used the corruption of the Thunder Warriors, the first generation, so to say, of the Space Marines, in their just raw brutality and loss of reason within that context, and applied it purposefully to some of the Primarchs, specifically Sanguinius, and then all the Space Marines within the Legion under Sanguinius. Could it be? Is there such a speculation? I don't know.
His movements defied instinctive recognition, just as the human eye seeks patterns in motion, balance, in form, how the human eye can see something artificial and just know it's not correct. Sanguinius exceeded the rules. He transitioned through melee as though physical laws themselves were being bent. So to watch him in combat was to feel something deeply unsettling. The descriptions of how Sanguinius appears in battle are particularly interesting because it leans on this emphasis that humans are instinctively trained in our brains to know when an image is false, to know when motion does not belong. It's like how for a long time CGI in movies was often very easy to detect. Your brain can just tell and see.
Yeah.
The same with AI now, ever more. So no matter how polished it might be, your brain is very good at just knowing that it's somehow not right, which really is an excellent analogy for us to imagine something like the Primarchs in combat, that these beings who are undoubtedly far above human ability, they're pushing the boundaries of what is possible within the parameters of reality, that the Angel of the Ninth Legion, for all of his aesthetic beauty, cannot separate himself from that unnatural distortion, so that what you're left with to witness is far from beautiful or awe-inspiring as you might imagine. It's disturbing. What I personally enjoy about this observation and rare, brutally honest description is that for one thing it highlights this paradox of the Primarchs themselves, in the sense that they were created as weapons engineered to surpass humanity, yet the cost of that perfection is estrangement from the very things that they sought to protect. Sanguinius inspired loyalty and adoration, but when he is witnessed unleashing his full fury, it is far from this. It is horrifying. It is monstrous. All the Primarchs had aspects of this, but I think in those such as Guilliman or Sanguinius, the dissonance was more sharp because of the fact that it came clothed in something that ordinarily was more relatable, or that this mythically angelic form could descend so far. The other part to it is that I like the fact that we get a real angle instead of the propaganda, because perspectives of the Astartes and their campaigns are still often being told to us through something of the imperial lens, not the human lens, and I find those two things to be quite separate.
Right.
When you get a remembrancer or some other human figure of note describing how they perceive such figures, the reality is often far more unsettling and contemptuous and apathetic when stacked against the propaganda that would have you otherwise believe. Often during the heresy, you do get these moments where humans encounter beings that have been so incredibly built up to us through narrative and descriptions and emotion, and then a human comes to meet them, and the human fully understands that this being could destroy them, eradicate them, and specifically for that reason, they seem to cease caring about their own existence. They almost have a contempt for what they are trying to be, trying to break down their egos in a very human way. The sense that we're told these are these aspirational, golden, immense beings that everybody should be prostrating themselves in awe of. And that is often the case, but you still get those humans who see through the charade and just say, no, I'm not having this. And I like that very much. So the tension of what they were reached a grotesque expression when Sanguinius IX was sent to attend a situation developing upon Signus Prime. Horus himself had directed Sanguinius IX Legion to Signus Prime, framing it as a campaign against potential Xenos. Sanguinius believed they were carrying out a legitimate crusade order from the War Master. They had no reason to presume otherwise. This was, though, a plan to either turn, delay, or destroy the Ninth. During the heresy, many actions were taken to slow or delay those that Horus knew were very unlikely to be turned to his cause. For example, also around this time, and staged under Forus's false orders, the word-bearers had arrived at Calth, and subsequently, in one of the most devastating assaults of the heresy, they turned upon the Ultramarines, slaughtering them and using the system's star as a sacrifice to birth the Ruin Storm. The Ruin Storm was very significant.
The Burning Star. Okay, now this might be the context that I'm missing regarding the song about the Blood Angels, where the Burning Star is being referenced. Let me just backtrack a little bit and listen to it again.
Likely to be turned to his cause. For example, also around this time, and staged under Forus's false orders, the word-bearers had arrived at Calth, and subsequently, in one of the most devastating assaults of the heresy, they turned upon the Ultramarines, slaughtering them and using the system's star as a sacrifice to birth the Ruin Storm.
Okay, no.
The Ruin Storm...
This is directly just for the word-bearers, not connected, I guess, to the Blood Angels, at least yet. Okay, let's continue.
...was very significant, because this was a warp storm so immense, it split the galaxy in two, thereby severing communication and travel, plunging the heresy into the so-called Age of Darkness. The destruction of the Ultramarines was of course never a possibility. Their legion was just too big. It was one of the largest in existence, and worse still for Horus, he knew always that Guilliman was far too pragmatic and loyal to be turned. So with the best laid plans of the word-bearers, all they could hope for was to prevent the 13th Legion from reaching Terra. To be clear, the Ruin Storm was not a literal tear in reality, such as the Cicatrix Maledictum in M41. It was an overflowing incursion by the warp, which soaked into and contaminated real space. Skies warped into visions of hell, demons spilled out upon worlds, areas were cut off from central command, scattered Astartes were forced to fight in isolation, as the Imperium became consumed by now the full outbreak of the heretical war. So when the Blood Angels entered the Signus system, they expected to find standard compliance missions. From the outset, though, it was clear something was already deeply wrong here. The laws of reality were breaking down, preventing them from leaving, and one planet had even fractured into demonic runes. Upon their search for human survivors, all they found were grim remnants. Upon one planet, they were even set upon by reanimated wreckage. A hive city itself appeared to have come to life. The corrupted world was subsequently subjected to exterminatus. So things were already very deeply contaminated here and very, very wrong. Sanguinius ordered additional expeditions to the inner Signus worlds, but what they encountered here was just more absence of humanity, just demonic horrors. They found little that there was to realistically achieve. And from here on, their nightmare encounter just unfolded steadily. There was no explosion of horror as had been seen at, say, Istvan. Their fleet's chronometers began to display impossible numbers, recurring sixes of M31. These repeated endlessly, as if time itself had broken, which of course it had. As ever for the creatures of the warp, next came the voices. At this time especially, knowledge of the warp and what dwelled within remained very limited, and so mortals in the fleet began hearing whispers that were not theirs. Their nerves, their minds, their spirit disintegrated. The stronger among the crewmen just went slowly mad, others had far more visceral responses, some tearing out their own eyes, scratching their faces, others turned their weapons upon those around them and then themselves. Decks ran red with the blood of those who'd never even faced their enemy. The Astartes, of course, have naturally more resilience to such torments, but I think during this era of the Crusade, you see them be more susceptible to contamination by chaos simply due to them having limited understanding and it conflicting against their actual beliefs, which of course was why Malcador said probably should have told everybody about the warp.
Yeah.
Whereas in the contemporary period of M41, Space Marines tend to have a grasp of the nature of what they face, and thus it makes them more stalwart against the horror, which is why, as Malcador said, probably should have told everybody about the warp. For the Astartes of the force deployed to Signus, there was no guarantee of default immunity. Though they did not break in the same way, they were still forced to restrain their mortal crews. They shackled some, killed others, before the contagion of madness could spread any further. And that, of course, had a demoralizing impact on the crew and themselves. The Legion found itself fighting for control among its own vessels, even before they had encountered any enemy or even knowing really what they were supposed to be doing, which was very depressing. It was in the midst of this confusion that Kairis the Perverse, a keeper of secrets of Slaanesh, a greater demon, intruded directly into the Primarch's sanctum. Its image filled the chamber of Sanguinius with a vision of an entity of impossible beauty and foul corruption. It mocked and baited him. It dared the Primarch to approach Cygnus Prime, and where his more measured brothers may have hesitated, Sanguinius did not. He accepted the challenge, and their course was set for a surface deployment. And again, that speaks to the nature of Sanguinius. He was always all in or not at all. Between Horus...
By the way, all in or not at all is very much an angelic feature. Again, back to Catholic theology a little bit. Angels are all in or not at all. That's their nature by definition. So unlike us, who have a choice to change constantly, to be on the side of good or on the side of evil, and while at least we are on this earth as travelers, we have options and we can change. The angels, though, it's not as if they didn't have a choice. They did have a choice. God gave them a choice. God wanted also free consent, even from angels, his first children, we can say, whether to love him and whether to accept their own natures as such. But their choice, unlike our choice, is immediately infinite. It's complete. It's either completely yes or completely no. Their existence, of course, is not bound within this temporal reality. That's one part of the reason, definitely. And also they had greater knowledge, so the choice that they made was much more, informed. And the bad decisions that we make here on Earth is always, at least in some measure, influenced by the lack of knowledge that we have. Even when our will is very malicious, everything that we perceive will always be in the form of some good. So even when we chose some very much lesser good in spite of some greater good, it is some good that we're seeking. Anyhow, angels are yes or no, binary, very much. The demons are those who said no to their own natures, to their own destinies, to God. And angels are those who now enjoy beatific vision in the presence of God, and those who serve him, such as Saint Michael the Archangel, right? And they are the ones who said yes. Now, when we apply that to human lives, there are some people definitely, just on a psychological level, who function more like that, don't you? I think, well, look around you. I mean, maybe yourself even, or people that you know. Some are much more temperate, so to say, and some are just, all in. Either you go all in or you don't go there at all. So people more prone to addictive behavior are like that. They have, so to say, like an angelic mark in them, which is great, which is beautiful. I mean, it's neither in itself morally good or bad. It's a fact. So when they overly indulge in bad things, it drives them to addiction and very bad behavior. But when they choose to fight and to be virtuous, that they can dedicate themselves in an incredible way and I guess reach sanctity, holiness faster and stronger than the usual person. It's a risk, and I like Sanguinius because of his nature as he is depicted in here, that all or nothing, very much an angelic trait that he has within himself, which for me, again, is an immediate indication for the writers of the story of this character to have at least a fundamental knowledge of theology. Yeah.
And the dark apostle Erebus of the Wordbearers both had come to the conclusion that while Sanguinius likely couldn't be plainly urged to join their cause, they could exploit the Blood Angel's flaw, as was discovered by Horus, to see Sanguinius and his legion fall to the most similarly aligned path, that being, of course, Khorne. However, as is typical within the great game of chaos, all is lies and deception. Slaanesh had other plans. Kyrus and again chaplain Erebus wished to convert Sanguinius to their banner. Such is the discordant nature of chaos, they couldn't even agree on the most simple of goals here. For while Erebus wanted to recruit Sanguinius, Horus and the bloodthirster Kabanda and wordbearer Tanis Creed saw the Primarch as being too unmovable in his loyalties. They quite simply just wanted Sanguinius dead. And then the corrupted Blood Angels would most likely slide back into their revenant ways, falling under the War Master's banner. Signus was a disaster for the Loyalists, for before the Blood Angels could even deploy, their fleet was assailed from the void. Corpse ships, derelicts, animated by demonic will, crewed by their dead. They deluged the Blood Angels' fleet, and the losses mounted. Admiral Athene, commander of the Imperial Army, had been completely lost by now, and manically ordered their flagship, a massive Gloriana-scale battleship, into a collision course with the planet below. Only Sanguinius' intervention prevented disaster. He was able to seize the ship's controls and force the vessel into an emergency landing, but the impact was still so severe it caused significant damage. But the flagship and its crew survived. But now they were on the planet itself. The 9th Legion advanced into the absolute nightmare that awaited them. The Keeper of Secrets Cathedral was a palace of impossible architecture. It dominated the horizon. In a macro iteration of the Palace of Slaanesh, it also defied censors. Its internal laws were lethal in and of themselves. Nonetheless, it had to be destroyed. At their head marched First Captain, Chapter Master Raldoron, equerry to the Primarch, and one apothecary Meros, guiding the vanguard, while their Primarch carved a path through the demons, the cultists, and word-bearers. The city of Signus became their crucible, the streets drowned in blood, the sky filled with shrieking, immaterial entities. But also facing them were the forces of Khorne, including the greater demon, Kabanda. This was a being of true nightmare, an irresistible glabrous form, its skin the colour of dried gore, and it stood now before them, defiantly in their path. It sought not only to kill Sanguinius, but to break him. It promised power, exaltation, through, of course, bloodshed, securing for himself an eternal place at Khorne's side. To the surprise of none, Sanguinius' refusal was absolute. The duel between Sanguinius and the demon was titanic. The Primarch struck a deep wound early upon the demon, but with his whip, the demon crushed the angel's legs and hurled him down, leaving the Primarch broken and helpless. And then the Bloodthirster turned its rage upon the Ninth, leaving 500 Astartes slain in an absolute storm of slaughter. The saturation of blood that had been spilled fueled the activation of a warp engine known as the Ragefire. Devised by Erebus, it had been intended to corrupt Sanguinius and his sons, for within it lay Blood Angel brother Targus. He was mutilated and half dead. He was an individual whom Erebus had stolen from Fabius Baal's early laboratory developments, and now stripped of all which had made him a Blood Angel, driven mad by the pain and rage, he was the conduit for a rage that would consume the entire Legion. The Ragefire amplified and unleashed the red thirst that had so haunted and been carefully concealed by the Legion. And that moment in and of itself is a real nod to the fact that the flaw, the thirst within the Blood Angels, is very much a psychic element tied to their soul, not necessarily genetic, as Sanguinius believed.
Great, I actually like this addition. Okay.
The psychic backlash of the ritual reverberated across the battlefield and slammed into the Primarch's soul, dragging him into unconsciousness. And at the same time, it shattered the restraints within his legion's blood. This was a similar iteration of what would be seen later toward the end of the heresy. This was a precursor and a sign of that connection which existed between Sanguinius and his sons.
Good. It's not a part of their original nature. That's the whole point. As the same way how our concupiscence or our weakness, our ignorance, our malice are not parts of our original nature, but are consequences of our fall, of the original fall, of the original sin. Again, it makes perfect sense. So I'm glad that once more this is in a quite nice accord with the history of salvation.
The flaw they had always borne, the thirst they'd always suppressed, was unleashed, and now the Astartes who had once fought with perfect discipline fell into screaming madness, howling, tearing at their enemies with fingers, even teeth and nails. They tore at flesh, they drank of their foes. What was revealed upon Signus was a darkness that the Blood Angels would be forced to exist with forever in the form of the Black Rage and the Death Company. Sanguinius would be forced to subsequently confront this truth, that his legion could be collectively transformed from the redeemed into butchers if the flaw was triggered.
Yeah.
It wasn't just latent, it was an active defect in all of the Ninth Legion. Remembering the Remembrancer's earlier words, that their savagery was already beyond human comprehension.
So what's the difference? Instead of being latent and an active component, it's not like some specific circumstances have to happen in order for the trigger to happen, for the latent thing to become activated from potential to active, but something that is constantly pressing and pushing, maybe sometimes weaker, maybe sometimes stronger, but an ever-present thing that is gnawing at your mind. It's a difference, okay? It's a big difference, actually.
Now this was confirmed in the unfolding apocalypse. So Sanguinius' hopes of waiting until after the Crusade to fix this problem seemed all but hopeless. Meanwhile, Captain Ralderon and Meros had led their strike team in an effort to destroy the demonic fortress, the Cathedral of the Mark. They faced their own test of character, though, as they now fought through little hordes of demonettes and bloodletters, attempting to reach the cathedral, yet within its walls only lay more terror and the traitors. The Red Thirst was still consuming the Blood Angels in a dark rage which propelled them against any in their path. They faced all with the same unthinking ferocity and disregard for their own preservation. And during this campaign, a group of Space Wolves had been attached to the fleet, and they, among any remaining human cultists and wordbearers, were now also in the sights of the raging, thirsting whirlwind. They were slaughtered, save for a few of the librarians who appeared able to resist this thirst, and for some time they also had been having visions. They were unsure how to proceed, given that they were constrained by the agreements that had been signed at the Council of Nicaea that effectively had outlawed psychers in the legions. In a prime example, though, of why forbidding all psychic activity within the Imperials could never be enacted as an unbreakable law.
Of course, I presume that you know that Cycle of Nicaea, if it's Greek pronunciation or even classical Latin, it would be Nicaea, the first ecumenical council of the church. So, and first anathema sit pronounced was on that council. Well, what is it? I mean, it's making distinctions between what is the actual faith and the substance of the actual faith, and what are deviations, what are the heresies. So, yeah. Of course, there has to be a little bit of that as well inside of Warhammer 40k.
The librarians used their powers to help Sanguinius to recover. But now, though, the torrent of raging blood angels had reached the cathedral. They were no longer an army under any command, they were a raw tide of instinct and compulsion. Wave after wave broke against the structure, its corrupted defenders absent of any cohesion themselves. They met the broken legionnaires and all descended into a raging frenzy. It was pure chaos. Bolters, now exhausted of their ammunition, were just being used to bludgeon anyone and anything into pulped matter. Chainswords, power fists, even their bare hands pounded and ripped at anything in reach. Space Marines, Terminators, even Dreadnoughts, all were pulled down into the dark filth of slaughter. The scene was truly an offence to all the Imperium and Crusade stood for many who were guarding the cathedral had been formed from the remnants of Signus's people, their flesh warped into vessels for the unknowable entities, and the sight unfolding was abhorrent. Other things were not entirely present in reality. They required bodies of the dead and living alike to anchor themselves. For any who might have observed this, it was difficult to discern who were the most terrifying force. The angels seemed to be irredeemable. The nobility of Sanguinius' sons, their reformed sense of control and discipline, had wholly collapsed into nothing more than the savagery many had long felt defined them. Inside the cathedral, Meros and the others were in the presence of the returning Kabanda and the Slaneshi demon, Kairos. Both were enriched by the deteriorating situation facing the Loyalists. They could sense the end approaching. And worse, Meros and his companions now saw the shackled body of one of their own, and recognized him. Raldoron called out, "It's Targus, captain of the 111th. They couldn't understand how or what he was here for, but it was clear he had been destroyed and tormented to an unimaginable degree.
Yeah.
Raldoron and the other Blood Angels present now unleashed their own, more coherent rage against the demonic horrors. Yet even as they destroyed bloodletters, threw bolter and blades against the greater demon and its kin, word-bearers came for Raldoron. But he dispatched them as the filth they were, much to the delight of Kairos. It blocked any retreat by the Loyalists, picking up the captain, tossing him to its companion demon to finish it. Commander stalked in for the kill, but then hesitated. Sanguinius landed like a crack of thunder, his wings two transcendent arcs of white. Meros and Raldoron could not believe what they were seeing. The Primarch was already moving. He was like lightning. He did not even look at the goat-headed Slaneshi Kairos. Sanguinius' attention was on Kabanda. Yet with a mere flick of his arm, while in winged flight, Sanguinius' sword was in the air, singing as it cut across the room, to impale the pink-skinned, hellish creature against the back walls of the temple. Kairos screamed out. The Primarch now was already upon the Bloodthirster, even as it moved away, instantly forgetting the captain. Lesser demons were scattered in the wake of the Primarch, and when Kabanda drew its whip once more, Sanguinius blocked its descent with his wing, before catching its incoming axe. Kairos screamed out, having recovered in indignant rage, "Kill him!" While the Primarch and Bloodthirster traded verbal barbs, without warning Sanguinius twisted and shattered the demon's axe, and in the shock of the moment, the Primarch was upon it, pummeling it with a flurry of blows. The demon, not expecting to suffer such true damage, was spitting black blood, and when it again attempted to bring down its razored whip, Sanguinius flew with that same inhuman speed. It caught the whip and brought it down to the demon, wrapping it around its throat. They collapsed into the floor, but shocked by the brutality of the Primarch's attack, it could not free itself. Sanguinius tightened the coil around its neck. Kabanda attempted to free itself by unfurling its black wings. The Primarch tore them from their sockets. The demon thing knew true agony, perhaps for the first time. Finally, Sanguinius cast the hell creature into the warp flame pit that was at the centre of the cathedral hall. Sanguinius had banished Kabanda.
Nice.
Yet what the demon had unleashed within the Ninth Legion was not merely due to its presence or the acts that had occurred. Their unquenchable thirst for blood and violence had set such a blaze of ferocity that it could not leave their souls until every taint of chaos had been erased from the planet. Outside, the churning slaughter continued, and Signus Prime was still under the purge of rampaging blood angels. But now, with the absence of Kabanda, the Slaaneshi Greater Demon and Kairos the Perverse was a little more measured. Its earlier calls for the death of the Primarch, having just witnessed him dispatch a greater servant of Khorne, had surprisingly dissipated. It chose a different, softer tack, and perhaps hoped still to turn Sanguinius. Meros and the others still faced their own personal final test in the form of another word-bearer who had thrown in their lot with the demons, but they were simply now met with the fury and unleashed determination of the angels. Meros split open the traitor's face with bolter and blade. Signus was a slick of blood. Everywhere one cared to look lay the dead and their tattered remains. While it were true that the Ninth had lost themselves here, what had been severely underestimated by the enemy was that they did not lose their focus or skill. They were in fact more effective than ever, despite how they fought with their mindless, unseen ferocity. But far from being broken to a degree which left them as rampaging lunatics, what had occurred was that they were merely unshackled from the restraints placed upon them by the sensibilities of the crusade.
Right, but as well, it's not they're mindless. You cannot have focus and be mindless. So just the fact that their complete bloodlust, blood rage was directed towards the demons is a clear indication that they are not mindless. So that their rage can be directed. If they started to kill one another, like kill a demon, then kill one of yours, and kill a demon, stuff like that, that would be complete mindless. Like the berserker's rage, completely losing your mind and hitting everything around you. It's not like that, though. So it has nuance.
But this would not be the same as what was seen during the end of the Siege of Terror. This had merely unleashed their barbaric potential. The demons were now all but running in retreat, for the angels of death bore down upon them. Kairos and the others within the sanctum were all too aware of the looming quiet. It was evident that the tides of fate had shifted, and certainly not in their favour. The demon had only one card left to play. It observed how this body was nothing to it. It could easily fashion and form more flesh. Sanguinius marched toward it with a determination to end this horrifying episode now, his blade in his hand declaring, "You are defeated, creature. This war of horrors is over." Except at this, Kairos was laughing. It looked to exploit Sanguinius and leverage his foresight, his sense of the necessity for transformation and sacrifice. It declared that the Ragefire construct was no random object of ceremony. It was a manifestation of the darkness inside Sanguinius himself. It was the warp. It was the wrath in them all. It even claimed that Sanguinius was tainted by the forces of the warp as he was cast to that ill-fated world, just as the Emperor had speculated. Kairos offered its deal. If the Primarch would give himself fully to the Ragefire construct, then Kairos would ensure the Legion would be cured of its thirst, which seems a stretch to believe. Nonetheless, in many ways Sanguinius was now at his lowest ebb, and so incomprehensibly considered stepping into the vortex in sacrifice for his legion and the flaw within his own.
Interesting.
Those Astartes who stood by now could see that Sanguinius was seriously considering taking the deal.
Yeah, he's being tempted. He's considering his situation. And now the actual act of the virtue of prudence is necessary. What to choose for the best possible outcome.
So with no warning, Apothecary Meros leapt forward. He cut the lines for the suspended Ragefire construct, thereby catapulting himself toward the Chaos Vortex. Sanguinius followed, but too late. Inside the vortex, Meros refused to let his Primarch take the deal, instead stating that he knew, in the end, his Primarch would face Horus, and that this was a destiny he must see through. Meros removed his own gene seed, passing it to Sanguinius, before allowing the rage to possess him. What was experienced by him was a realm of unimaginable suffering, a vacuum of all emotions other than the unrelenting waves of rage. He wished vengeance for Targus, and held on to that even as he himself was consumed by the fire and fury that overwhelmed him. Meros, the apothecary, was dead, but the librarian sensed a new form emerging in this transition. The Ragefire capsule was destroyed, but within the realm of souls, something stirred. The Ragefire of 100,000 warriors collapsed, and the Psychers could feel Meros transformed. His face twisted, his armor distorted and blackened, its entire structure trembling as it struggled to retain the energies unleashed. Blood-drenched wings. The Red Angel.
The Red Angel.
Sanguinius.
Okay, I think this will be the place where I'm gonna stop and continue in the next episode, the second part of this reaction. The Red Angel. Now, it is also an indication what would have happened, I guess, if Sanguinius stepped inside. So I don't know yet. We don't know yet what's going to happen or what actually happened at that moment. But in the continuation of this, I'll see if I have the time to actually finish this today. I would like to. Well, I'm still kind of hyped up. If not, then at the latest tomorrow, I'm going to watch the rest of it. And of course, after the first part is being published, which you're watching on YouTube, probably 1 or 2 days later, or maximum couple of days later, the second part should be published as well, because the editing process is a big part of actually publishing it. And I'm far from an expert. This has been so far a great and interesting watch. I hope you enjoyed watching this together with me. Like, share, subscribe, etc., etc. And I will see you in the second part. God bless you all, and goodbye.